Greetings, this is John with E511 with the first commentary video in a while. This will be a lesson in deception. It'll be covering one of the many examples of the hypocrites and frauds that the Charlie Kirk assassination helped expose. And this was a somewhat impromptu video. I threw the script together for this in less than a week, but important nonetheless. And it's a good warm-up for future videos where I hopefully get to talk about some other hypocrites and how they dealt with the Charlie Kirk situation. And this will also be another good lesson in how exposing ecumenicism and calling out false teachers, using words like discernment, is becoming one of the best covers for wolves in sheep's clothing. Mike Winger has been using this approach for a while and been getting good results. Spencer Smith does this. Good Fight Ministries has been utilizing this approach for decades. Protestia, Justin Peters, the list goes on and on. By this point, it's become a market in and of itself. And with so much low-hanging, rotten, corrupt fruit, it's easy for even some of the biggest hypocrites to call it out, to carve out a little market for themselves and give themselves a convincing disguise as a quote-unquote safe Bible teacher. But it's all a big sham. Well, here's another example of that. This one a little bit less well-known. Pastor Michael Grant. I've seen him pop up here and there in my recommendations in the past. Saw people in my comment section mention him as someone that they follow and trust as a sound Bible teacher. And when you look through his videos, he seemingly has a good take on a lot of what's going on. He's got videos exposing not just Bethel, but Mike Winger and Wes Huff, Kirk Cameron, Ruslan, along with many other popular evangelical apologists. He calls out Catholicism, preaches against free grace and once saved, always saved. He seems like an even better version of Joe Schimmel at first glance. And even though his channel is much larger than mine, at least the one that I built after my first one was taken down, he's also not on the level of, a Good Fight Ministries or Spencer Smith or Mike Winger, Ruslan, Alyssa Childers, Kirk Cameron, etc. Channels that are so popular that it's suspicious. Right? He's not a celebrity Christian. So he's right in that sweet spot where you think he's not trying to cater to what's popular. He's not trying to gain followers at the expense of truth. And he's also a pastor, so he's got that extra level of legitimacy. And so with all that together, he calls out all the big name wolves, and not just the ones that everyone else calls out. He's not too popular to where you think he's itching people's ears. He doesn't seem to network with other people. So it seems like, he really cares about maintaining the purity of his ministry, and he's not going to let anybody compromise that. He's a pastor with seemingly good doctrine. You would think this guy is sound, that he's safe. Seems like he's got it all. And then here in his About section on his YouTube page, it says, pastor of a Bible-believing church in Massachusetts, I provide an alternative to the Christian YouTube establishment. I hold to all the same essential doctrines of the faith, but with an old-school approach, rejecting ecumenicalism, while advocating for discernment and ecclesiastical separation from false teachers and those who endorse them. Sounds good, right? He's the alternative to the Christian YouTube establishment. He's like the Christian Trump, anti-establishment. He's draining the swamp. Well, unfortunately, that's a pretty accurate analogy. He is like the Christian Trump. Because just like Trump, he's a fraud like the rest, just without the charisma. Unfortunately, Pastor Michael Grant is just as much a part of the problem as everybody else. He's part of the swamp that he pretends to be against. And the first sign of that is in this About section. It smacks of trying too hard to paint a particular image of yourself. Alternative to the establishment, old school approach. It reads like a political platform. It reads like somebody who's trying to paint an image of themselves to get your vote. And when people try too hard to present themselves in a certain way, it's typically because they're using words to mask and deceive. Deep down, they know that their actions don't speak loud enough for themselves, and so they have to use extra words to give the impression that they want to give. As the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. Well, these people aren't capable of actions, so they have to rely extra hard on words. Here's the next sign that he's part of the Christian YouTube establishment. Members only. A whole section of members only content. Videos that you have to pay to see. Spencer Smith does this as well, along with many other Christian ministries and influencers. It's become an unfortunate, all too common practice today among the Christian establishment, hiding teachings and warnings and so forth behind a paywall. This is stuff that I've never done and never will do. It took me 6 years after first starting my YouTube channel for me to finally even set up a place where people could donate to me, because it finally sunk in, if I want to keep doing this full time, I have to have people support me. That's just the way it works. But I had to really be pressured into finally doing that. But I don't hide things behind paywalls. I don't monetize things. I tried doing that for a while, but realized that it wasn't right, considering the kinds of ads that would run on my videos. There's nothing wrong with making a living in ministry. Paul said those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And on many occasions, Paul received provisions from the churches. The issue is selling, okay? The issue is hiding things behind paywalls. That's the corrupt part of it. And the more you think about it, the more disgusted you'll be by it. For example, this video about Bill Johnson and Bethel. Local churches, please be on notice, in all caps. But you have to pay money to hear what this pastor has to say to the churches. He supposedly wants his fellow brothers and sisters in Christ to be on notice about this dangerous thing coming from Bethel. But they have to pay him money to hear this warning. It's sickening. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul saying to the Galatians, Galatians, please be on notice about the dangerous teachings of the Judaizers, but you need to pay 10 denarii first. And then this one, examples of heresy from church history. Heresy, in case Pastor Grant forgot, is something that will lead you to hell. So you would think Pastor Grant would want as many people as possible to see examples of heresy because he supposedly cares about their souls. He's supposedly a brave shepherd who cares about the sheep, right? Well, you have to pay money to hear this Pastor Grant tell you about examples of teachings that could lead you to hell. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he actually has a Bible study behind a paywall as well. That's practically a church service. Okay? So this guy, this pastor, charges money to hear his teachings and warnings about dangerous things spreading through the church, about things that he wants his fellow brothers and sisters to hear, lest they be led astray and put on the broad road to hell. And what's especially disgusting about it is that he's already a pastor, meaning he already has a full-time job. I mean, I assume anyway, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that he's already making a full-time salary from people's giving, right? So this members-only stuff and all the money that he's making on ads through monetization, That's all supplemental income. Is he going to claim, like Spencer Smith did, that all that money is going into missions or something else supposedly righteous? Well, maybe he will, because here he is wearing some of Spencer's merch, right? Doctrine Matters t-shirt. Well, it doesn't matter, because no matter where that money is going, the way he acquired it is completely unbiblical. Using God's name to sell anything church-related explicitly violates Scripture. This is exactly what made Jesus flip over tables. Buying and selling in the temple. Okay? But on top of the sin of selling in the temple, so to speak, he adds the sin of hypocrisy because he calls out others for doing the very thing that he does. Here's a comment that he pinned on a recent video he did about Ruslan charging money for some VIP seating at a conference. He says, Ruslan claims because this is not a church event, it doesn't matter that he's charging big money for VIP seating and celebrity meet and greets. And while it's true that his event is not the same as a church, does that really mean the principles of James 2:1-4 no longer applies? And God now approves of showing partiality to those with money? No. So Pastor Grant is seemingly very passionate about this. He gets worked up about this sort of thing. But he does it himself. Who is he to criticize anybody for showing partiality to those with money? That's exactly what he does with his members only section. Ruslan might take it to another level, I get it, but this is still a violation of James 2. In fact, it's worse because, at least with the partiality that James was condemning, the people with less money still got to hear the message. They just got less comfortable seating. But you can't even hear Pastor Grant's members-only videos, which include dire warnings about heresy in the church and Bible studies. You can't even hear those unless you give him money. At least the people who were treated like second-class citizens in James got to hear the messages. And if Pastor Grant is going to use the excuse, well, I don't charge people to come to my church, those aren't church videos, it's different. Well, then I'll appeal to what he said about Ruslan charging extra money for VIP seating. Does that mean that the principles of James 2 no longer apply, and God now approves of showing partiality to those with money? No. So even according to Pastor Grant, it doesn't matter if it's happening within the confines of a church. And if it doesn't matter whether it's happening in a church when Ruslan does it, then it doesn't matter when Michael Grant or anyone else does it either. And therefore, Michael Grant is guilty of the same partiality in violation of James 2. And the fact that he's a pastor also makes it worse. And notice how he continues to emphasize how anti-Christian establishment he supposedly is. He says, the Christian YouTube establishment isn't happy with myself or Protestia. To check out what Protestia said, watch their podcast here. And if you're not familiar with Protestia, it was originally founded by J.D. Hall, who got exposed back in 2023 for attacking his family and a bunch of other stuff. And even though he stepped away from Protestia and supposedly left ministry, since then he's developed a very close relationship with Joel Webben of Right Response Ministries, which is now called NXR Studios, stands for the New Christian Right. And they co-wrote a book together that came out last year called The Hyphenated Heresy, Judeo-Christianity. So J.D. Hall, since being exposed for attacking his family, has fully joined the new Nazism and is helping to build the foundation of the future beast system that will destroy Mystery Babylon, Jerusalem. And even though David Morrill, who's now running Protestia, has seemingly been critical of Joel Webben in the past, he also seems to be staying pretty quiet about the radicalization of their former founder. So they're disgusting hypocrites as well. And it's fitting that Michael Grant promotes them. Birds of a feather. In fact, that's all his videos seem to be. Just reading Protestia articles and adding a little extra commentary. This guy has no originality at all. Which makes it even more absurd that he charges money for some of his videos because he's basically just a glorified mouthpiece for Protestia. Right? You can just read their articles yourself and basically get the same information. Now, here's what this video is really about. That was just a little introduction. And this will definitively prove that this so-called pastor is a complete liar and fraud. The other day, I saw this video of his pop up in my recommendations about Paula White and Kid Rock, who apparently calls Paula White his pastor. Kid Rock's pastor, Paula White, demands $100K. Now, obviously, both of these people are complete clowns who make a mockery of Christ. Right? They're some of the lowest hanging fruit out there. No argument there. But upon seeing the video, I immediately thought, well, Charlie Kirk was associated with Paula White. I did a whole compilation video about Charlie Kirk's years-long friendship with Paula White. He featured her at TPUSA events. And then shortly after his death, she talked about how they were friends, how he consulted her on important issues. And he never repudiated her, right? He never rebuked her as a prosperity grifter, never said, hey, sorry for platforming her. She's a fraud. I've expelled her from TPUSA. None of that. And of course he couldn't, because that would have offended President Trump, who considers Paula White his spiritual advisor. And Charlie Kirk helped to get Trump elected, and calling out Paula White would have rocked that boat. So if he had any issues with Paula White, he stayed quiet about them. And so knowing that Charlie Kirk was friends with Paula White and promoted her at his events, I also recalled that Pastor Grant had called Charlie Kirk a Christian right after he was killed. I had looked him up after someone mentioned him in my comments and came across a video that he did about Charlie Kirk right after his assassination, and remembered that he considered him a Christian, like practically everybody else, the YouTube Christian establishment. And we'll get into that video in a little bit. But the point is, I remembered that Pastor Grant had called Charlie Kirk a Christian. And I thought, who's this guy to make a video condemning Kid Rock for being associated with Paula White when Charlie Kirk was friends with her? And so I went and looked up the video, confirmed that that's what he had said, and then I commented this on his Kid Rock and Paula White video. I said, but Charlie Kirk, who was friends with Paula White and countless others like her, and went to a church with a female pastor, was a Christian according to you. And then I reiterated to this person who responded, I'm talking about Charlie Kirk, who he, Pastor Grant, defended as a Christian, despite being just as bad as Kid Rock, friends with the same people, etc. And please hear me, it was not just Paula White. Charlie Kirk surrounded himself with wolves. Lance Wallnau, Tucker Carlson, Sean Foyt, Che On, Russell Brand, Mark Driscoll, Jonathan Cahn, Michael Knowles, who's a Catholic, Megyn Kelly, another Catholic, Dr. Taylor Marshall, another Catholic, Jack Posobiec, another Catholic, who held up the rosary at Charlie Kirk's memorial and who Charlie Kirk regularly did shows with. And he didn't just fellowship with Catholics. He openly affirmed their false gospel as a legitimate form of Christianity that he agrees with on 90% of the important issues. And I have that video up on my channel as well. Also, Brandon Tatum, who denies the deity of Christ. He does not believe that Jesus Christ is God. He was very explicit about that back in 2020. He's not even a Christian on paper. And yet Charlie Kirk talked about Jesus with him before millions of people as if he was a Christian. Had him at TPUSA events talking about God and Jesus as if he's a true Christian. And even had him associated with the religious wing of TPUSA TPUSA faith. So Charlie affirmed a Christ-denying heretic as a fellow brother in Christ. He was also on TBN, said that we needed a strong Mormon church in America again, and was also friends with Grant Cardone, who's a financial guru, a billionaire, and a Scientologist. The network that Charlie Kirk built was just as bad, if not worse, than what you see on TBN and Daystar. And on top of that, he openly promoted Christian nationalism and the Seven Mountain Mandate, talking about influencing the Seven Mountains of culture, which he probably got from his good buddy Lance Wallnau. And he also went to a very Pentecostal charismatic church that has a female senior pastor who co-pastors the church with her husband. The list is practically endless with Charlie Kirk. And so I had all that in mind when I saw this video from Michael Grant condemning Kid Rock for being associated with Paula White, which prompted me to point out the obvious inconsistency and double standard in him calling Charlie Kirk a Christian, but rebuking and condemning Paula White and Kid Rock. And if you look through the comment section on his videos, Michael Grant doesn't respond to that many comments, at least not on that video. But he responded to mine, probably because he knew that what I was saying was damaging, and he felt like he had to defend himself. And before people say, well, you respond to a bunch of comments, yes, I typically respond to comments as a general practice. He doesn't, or at least not as much as I do. That's the difference. Out of all the comments that he chose to respond to, this was one of the few on that video. And here's what he said. We'll read all the way through it and then go back and pick it apart. False. I said I wasn't going to run the guy down after he was just murdered. I showed his testimony. I never said he was a good Christian. Rather, sometimes God takes people home early before they go off the rails fully. I never claimed to know the state of Kirk's soul, but TPUSA is dangerous at this point. So much wrong with that comment. It's actually impressive how much manipulation and contradiction he was able to squeeze in that one brief comment. Now, first of all, he says false, but it's not clear what specifically I said was false, which is a clue that he's lying and trying to manipulate. Now, all I said to him was that he called Charlie Kirk a Christian, which, as I'll show you in a bit, is 100% true. So what exactly was false? He's already lying and manipulating with his very first word, okay? Then he says, I said I wasn't going to run the guy down after he was just murdered. Now, this is one of the excuses that he gave in the video that we'll talk about in a second, which he did in response to people criticizing him for the positive things that he said about Kirk in the first video podcast a few days earlier. Initially, he did this episode of his Testing the Spirits podcast, The Faith of Charlie Kirk, on September 11th, literally the day after he was killed, where he spoke very positively of Charlie Kirk. And then he did another one a few days later where he doubled down on the positive things that he said and did somewhat of a soft rebuke of people who were criticizing him for what he had said. And that's the video that we're going to look at in a little bit. Now, even if that was a valid point, where he says, I wasn't going to run the guy down after he was just murdered, that has absolutely nothing to do with what I said to him. So now he's deflecting by bringing up irrelevant points. Again, all I said to him was, you called Charlie Kirk a Christian, which is a simple fact. And now he's talking about things that have nothing to do with that fact. This is a liar who's getting caught, and he's trying to come up with anything he can to confuse and obfuscate. And it fails miserably. And that really comes through here where he says, I never said he was a good Christian. Notice what he's doing. he's now adding this qualifier good that I never said, right? I didn't say you called him a good Christian. I just said that you called him a Christian. So without even looking at the video in question, just on this comment exchange alone, he's exposing himself as a manipulative liar. He's creating a straw man, right? A straw man is a misrepresentation of what someone says, and then you go and attack that misrepresentation to make it look like you're winning the argument. And his straw man is, you claimed I said he was a good Christian, which is completely false. I never said that. This is what people do when they don't have a leg to stand on, and they try to come up with schemes to make it seem like they're winning the argument. And then it gets even worse. He says, sometimes God takes people home early before they go off the rails fully. So he's now reaffirming that he believes Charlie Kirk is in heaven. Hence him saying God takes people home early. And then he says, before they go off the rails fully. And apparently fellowshipping with countless wolves like Paula White and pushing the Seven Mountain Mandate and ecumenicism and Catholicism, that's not going off the rails fully, according to Pastor Grant, even though he supposedly calls all those things out as deceptions that lead people to hell. But I don't know. I haven't paid the members-only fee. And then remember what he says in his About section. Ecclesiastical separation from false teachers and those who endorse them. So not just separation from false teachers, but separation from those who endorse them. So even if Michael Grant was able to present a solid case that Charlie Kirk wasn't a false teacher himself, which would be absurd, there's no way that he could make the case that Charlie Kirk didn't endorse false teachers. Which means, by Pastor Grant's standard, he should also practice ecclesiastical separation from Charlie Kirk. And ecclesiastical is just another word for church. And calling Charlie Kirk a Christian would be the opposite of ecclesiastical church-related separation. Right? If Pastor Grant considers someone a Christian, then that means he would allow them in his church, in fellowship, right? But even as late as March 2026, when he made this comment to me, Michael Grant still contends that Charlie Kirk hadn't fully gone off the rails by the time he died, and that God took him home to heaven early to keep him from going to hell. That's what Pastor Grant just said. So apparently he hasn't done too much discerning since initially making his videos about Charlie Kirk, which were bad enough at the time. But to call Charlie Kirk a Christian this late in the game is just plain embarrassing. And then here's the grand finale to this disaster of a comment. I never claimed to know the state of Kirk's soul. Except, what did he just say? That God took him home. Is that not making a claim about the state of Kirk's soul? Of course it is. It's astonishing that he put this utter nonsense in writing. He clearly made a direct claim about the state of Kirk's soul, and then immediately in the next sentence says, I never made a claim about the state of his soul. You are seeing complete spiritual blindness on display. This guy is such an obvious fraud, it's unbelievable. And he's a pastor with over 40,000 subscribers who's supposedly guarding the sheep against wolves and deceptions. He's calling out Ruslan and Mike Winger and Kirk Cameron and all the rest. And yet he's just as much of a blind hypocrite as they are. And here was my response to him, which prompted some immediate action on his part, to say the least. You've already resorted to strawmanning what I said by adding the good part, which is an obvious sign that you know your take on Charlie Kirk was bad, and you're resorting to manipulative tactics to try and deflect. You're lying in writing, Pastor. What part of what I said was false exactly? You literally called Kirk a Christian in your video on him. That's what you said. And you never claimed to know the state of Kirk's soul? What would calling him a Christian be other than making a direct claim about the state of his soul? Where do Christians go when they die, Pastor? And then I quote him saying, God takes people home early before they go off the rails fully. So wait, is that a claim about the state of his soul? You're all over the place. So that was my comment, and at some point, he panicked because he knew I had him. And I don't know if it was before I made this comment or after, but he blocked me. You cannot see this comment thread on that video. He couldn't contend with my simple cross-examination, and his only other option was to block me. But that's not all he did. Before I responded to his comment, I wanted to double-check that I had my facts right before I doubled down on what I said, something that he probably should have done. I went and searched for that original video on Charlie Kirk, or at least the one that I saw, and I couldn't find it. Before, I found it by searching Charlie on his channel, and this video, A Lesson in Discernment, came up. But all of a sudden, after our exchange, it didn't come up. Well, thankfully, I have much experience in this area and knew that it would be in my browser history, and it wasn't too hard to find. I found the link and was able to pull it up because thankfully he didn't delete it or make it private, which is probably what he should have done. And as you can see here, it says unlisted. And if a video is unlisted, you're able to view it as long as you have the link. So at some point after commenting to me, he realized that I caught him in some contradiction and double standards, and he wanted to hide the evidence. But unfortunately for him, he didn't go nearly far enough. And apparently he didn't think that I'd be able to find this unlisted video. It's quite ironic that this video is called A Lesson in Discernment, isn't it? Which is where I got the title for this video, A Lesson in Deception. And I screen recorded this, just in case he or anyone else wants to claim that I doctored this in any way. And it says very clearly, I'm highlighting it with my cursor, unlisted. Now, why would he want to unlist this video? What's he hiding? Well, as I said in my response to him, which I don't know if he saw before he blocked me, you know your take on Charlie Kirk was bad. And that's the crux of it. He's clearly too much of a coward and lacked the spine to say the truth about Charlie Kirk back when he was killed, because he probably knew that he'd have the Charlie Kirk mob going nuts on his page, which if you followed me during that whole thing, you'll know what I'm talking about. They came at me like a woke mob. They're every bit as crazy as the woke left. You just have to press the right buttons. And so under the pressure of the environment, he chose the safest route possible, which was he had problems with his theology that I disagreed with, but he's still a Christian. Exactly what Joe Schimmel said. He wanted to appeal to his audience. So Pastor Grant here, who supposedly goes against the Christian YouTube establishment and has an old school approach that calls out ecumenicism and so forth, he's every bit the fence-sitting people pleaser that Mike Winger and his friends are. If you believe Charlie Kirk was a Christian, you are ecumenical by definition. So he can call out how ecumenical everybody is by joining up with TPUSA and all these other organizations and conferences. But by calling Charlie Kirk a Christian, he's essentially affirming his spiritual partnership with everything that he was involved with. Every fraud has their price. Some might have higher prices than others. You know, some might require more before they sell out, but eventually they all do. And Pastor Grant is showing you his price. By calling Charlie Kirk a Christian that he had disagreements with, Pastor Grant took the path of least resistance. Right? He satisfies many of his subscribers and members who might be critical of Charlie Kirk by saying that he disagrees with some of what Kirk said and mentioning that he had problems with his theology. But then he also satisfies the pro-Charlie Kirk crowd by calling him a Christian and showing him quote-unquote grace by not condemning him to hell. Right? He didn't go too far in either direction, the path of least resistance. But as it typically goes, the path of least resistance is also the path of delayed consequences. Because now, months later, after all the dust has settled, and more things are coming out about TPUSA and all the stuff that they're promoting and pushing, like at the memorial, it's starting to sink in with him that Charlie Kirk's fruit was pretty rotten. And he's realizing that his take back in September 2025 is not aging too well. Which apparently is still his take on Charlie Kirk, because remember, as he just commented to me the other day, in March of 2026, he still believes that Charlie Kirk is a Christian in heaven, right? Which is why he said God took him home early, even though he also claims that he didn't make any definitive claims about the state of Charlie Kirk's soul. So on one hand, he doubled down on what he said because he's too proud to admit that he's wrong. But on the other, he's not doubling down and recanting what he said because he enlisted this video, all because of my comment. Very strange, isn't it? This guy doesn't sound like he's on very solid ground. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, which is how you get ridiculous, contradictory, and manipulative comments like the one that he left me. And he knew that that comment was a contradictory mess, which is why he blocked me and got rid of the video. And he's also trying to act like Charlie Kirk wasn't the one who built up the utter heretical, ecumenical mess that is TPUSA, because he said TPUSA is dangerous at this point. As if it wasn't dangerous when Charlie Kirk was alive. He was the founder of it, for crying out loud. And Pastor Grant will talk about how, we can judge a false prophet by their fruits, which is a quote from Jesus. Well, the TPUSA that Pastor Grant's called out on multiple occasions since Charlie Kirk's death, is that not the fruit of Charlie Kirk? Of course it is. That's his legacy. That's what he built. A massive ecumenical organization of thousands of wolves and deceivers. Listen.
But we got to get into the faith community. Let's talk about what you're doing with the Faith Initiative. Are you going to churches? Are churches opening up? What's happening?
I've spoken to over 60 churches in the last year, 60. And by total accident, it's because they're only places that were open. And I realized that there was a real movement. And for every minute of criticism I give towards pastors, I want to give at least 10 seconds of praise. There are some good pastors out there. Rob McCoy, Jack Hibbs, James Cadiz, Pastor Jurgen, the Barnetts, Ken Graves. I could go through them. And they've warmly embraced me, and they want to be part of this kind of coalition. You know these people. That's why you're chuckling. So at Turning Point Faith, we're going to try to, our vision, and it might be foolishly optimistic, but I've been called that before, and now you can kind of see it. We want 1,000 Dietrich Bonhoeffers. We're not going to say like we're going to create them. I want to find them and encourage them. That's it. Find and encourage. Find and encourage. That's it.
Okay, so what happens? If someone goes, I want my church involved, a pastor's watching, they go, or pastor's wife says, I'm in. What do they do?
So I'll give you one piece of programming we have. We started something called Freedom Square. It's the first Tuesday of every month at Dream City Church, formerly Tom Lee Barnett's church, now Luke Barnett's church. It used to be Phoenix First, now it's Dream City Church.
Good.
We have 2,000 people that have showed up 2 months in a row. And we want to export this and empower and encourage pastors to do it for themselves. And I say, well, what is this? It's programming where we talk about all the local issues and how they intersect with the Bible. Pastor Jurgen's going to do it at Awaken Church, Jack Hibbs. We got Rob McCoy, and we got Steve Smotherman with his huge church out in Albuquerque. We want to get hundreds of churches to do that. The following's great and all this. Just commit yourself to courageous action that is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially in the public square.
All right, so just real quick, it's got 30 seconds. If I'm a young conservative listening to you right now and I'm going to church, can I promote this somehow in my church? What do I do?
Of course. You should go to your pastor and say, I want to have Turning Point Faith come to my church. And their pastor will say, no. And then you should ask again.
So there it is. He was talking about the beginnings of Turning Point Faith, which got started right after the pandemic. And back in 2021, there was so much momentum behind his TPUSA Faith Initiative because of how, so many churches got shut down during the pandemic, that he had already talked to 60 pastors willing to be part of this faith coalition, as Charlie put it, and was looking to get hundreds and thousands more involved. And he said to Lance Wallnau, you know these people, right? So Lance Wallnau, one of the most prominent authorities on the Seven Mountain Mandate, knows the pastors that Charlie was talking about, approved of them, and was wanting to help get more and more pastors and churches involved in this movement. So to everybody who says TPUSA was just a political organization, that's a lie. As Charlie Kirk explained here to Lance Wallnau, he was clearly attacking the religious church mountain, one of the 7 mountains of culture. And as he said to Lance Wallnau, he was trying to get churches across America to talk about all the local issues and how they intersect with the Bible. That's what he said. He was merging politics with religion, encouraging courageous action consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, as he said. TPUSA was not a merely political organization. After the pandemic, Charlie got inspired to get Christians across America to see how politics and religion are inseparable. That's at the heart of Christian nationalism and the Seven Mountain Mandate. And by the time of his death, TPUSA faith was not only endorsing Catholics and NAR people like Lance Wallnau and Sean Foyt, but Christ-denying heretics like Brandon Tatum. Tatum has been explicitly involved with TPUSA faith, not just TPUSA. And plus, after Charlie died, everybody was calling him a martyr of the faith, who was specifically killed for preaching the gospel. So which is it? Was he political or religious? Whichever suits the moment, I guess. Right? Whenever they want to talk about how great he was, they'll talk about how he was killed for the gospel. But then when he comes under criticism for the stuff that he promoted, then all of a sudden he's only political and not a pastor, etc. So Pastor Grant's comment that TPUSA is dangerous at this point is absurd. He's trying to make it sound like it only went off the rails after Charlie died. It didn't go off the rails after he died. It was already well off the rails from the moment that it was started, back when he was 18 and became a false convert. It's interesting how he became a Christian the very same year that he started TPUSA. That tells you everything you need to know about his aspirations and how he saw Christianity. It was a tool for him to acquire influence. And all the way back then, when he was 18, he believed that politics and religion intersected. That's why he started TPUSA.
We talk about all the local issues and how they intersect with the Bible. Commit yourself to courageous action that is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially in the public square.
And why is Pastor Grant trying to make it sound like TPUSA only went off the rails after Kirk died? Because he doesn't want to admit that he was wrong about Charlie. Right? If TPUSA was obviously bad when Kirk was alive, then Pastor Grant has to admit that he had no discernment about Charlie Kirk, which he didn't. So he didn't have the discernment or the spine to say the truth when it was unpopular to do so. It's aging poorly, and he's trying to erase the evidence. He's trying to whitewash and cover up. Now, let's look at some of the evidence that he tried to bury but failed. Here's what he said a few days after his initial video on Charlie Kirk, right after the assassination.
The title of this episode is A Lesson in Discernment. A lesson in discernment. In general, and especially in light of the Charlie Kirk assassination, because while 98% of my viewers agreed with what I said, literally 98.2%, I just checked the stats on YouTube, but I still received a few comments along with an email or two where a few people were upset that I said anything positive about Charlie Kirk.
As they should have been, because no true Christian should ever say anything positive about a wolf and deceiver like Charlie Kirk. Just like no one should say anything positive about Paula White or Benny Hinn or Kenneth Copeland. But note how he said that 98.2% of his viewers agreed with him. And he actually made it a point to include the 0.2. This is an insight into how he conducts his ministry. It matters to him that 98% of people agreed with him. And he probably knew that that would happen before making that video, which confirms that he's a fence-sitting people pleaser who knowingly chose the path of least resistance, as I said earlier. And this confirms it. And what's the point of him saying 98.2% of people agree with me? Right? Does that mean that if far less agreed with him, then he'd consider changing his tune? It must be. Otherwise, why mention it? Right? There's no point in talking about how many people agree with you unless it bears some significance in your mind. Right? It means if a lot more disagreed with him, then he'd ride that wave. And according to his logic, if 98% of people agree with you, then what you said must be true. If 98% of his congregants or his subscribers asked him to build a golden calf, like the people of Israel did with Aaron, then he'd build it because 98% of people said so. Otherwise, there's no point in flexing how many people agree with him.
98% of my viewers agreed with what I said. Literally 98.2%.
Based on that logic, he'd be among the false prophets of King Ahab, who outnumbered the prophet Micaiah 400 to 1. In fact, applying Pastor Grant's logic to that situation, out of 401 prophets, about 99.75% said that King Ahab would be victorious in battle. So they must have been right? 99.75% of the prophets concurred on an issue. So that must have been the right answer, right? Well, obviously not. That was deception from God. Only one prophet, 0.25% of the voices in that room were speaking the truth. There's a lesson in discernment for Pastor Grant. Numbers and consensus do not equate to truth.
This episode is a lesson in discernment. A lesson in discernment.
So despite painting himself as some discernment expert with an old school approach who goes against the grain of the YouTube Christian establishment, he goes with the flow like everybody else. At least when it came to Charlie Kirk. The irony. When it comes to Charlie Kirk, which is a pretty big issue, Mr. Anti-Establishment, Michael Grant, toes the party line. He had the same exact view about Charlie Kirk that the YouTube Christian establishment does. Mike Winger, Ray Comfort, Ruslan, Kirk Cameron, Mark Driscoll, they all agree that Charlie Kirk was a Christian. So on a very, very important and divisive issue within Christianity, Pastor Grant goes with the so-called Christian establishment that he pretends to oppose. And who was more Christian establishment than Charlie Kirk? He was the epitome of establishment Christianity. Give me a break. The founder of TPUSA? So we're not even 30 seconds into this video, and you're already seeing the problems with this guy. Much more to come.
Generally, these were comments about how Charlie was too ecumenical, or did you hear what he said here? Did you hear what he said about Mary, or this or that? And yeah, I did hear some of that, not all of it. But let me just address this briefly, and then I want to make a bigger point about my podcast and about discernment in general.
Oh boy, let's hear what this guy has to say about discernment, because he knows what he's talking about, right?
You know, the book of Ecclesiastes says there's a time to speak and a time to remain silent.
Well, he should have read that verse a little bit more carefully and actually stayed silent. This verse is one of the excuses that he's going to use to justify the positive statements that he made about Charlie Kirk right after his assassination in the first podcast on September 11th. It's very similar to the excuse that Chad Davidson of Good Fight Ministries used, which ironically also comes from the writings of King Solomon. Chad took Proverbs 27:14 out of context to justify not just saying positive things about Charlie Kirk, but doing an entire 180 on him. And maybe we'll talk more about that at some point later. And Pastor Grant is using a similar excuse. When people put a Bible verse in front of their manipulation, it can be very easy to accept it as a genuine reason. And that's why so many people use God and the Bible to try and manipulate. Now, here's the problem. The issue was not about Michael Grant being silent, which is what that verse is about. It's about completely staying silent, saying nothing. Michael did not stay silent. He just stayed silent about Charlie Kirk's deceptions. This is a sick, self-seeking manipulator using God's word to mask his deception. And also his cowardice. Right? The reason that he said those things about Charlie had nothing to do with discernment. It was because he was too much of a coward to say the truth. He's trying to justify his cowardice and reframe it as discernment. This is sick. Pastor Grant was not silent. He was anything but silent. Again, this was his second podcast about Charlie Kirk. The first one he did, The Faith of Charlie Kirk, which is what sparked some of the criticism that he's talking about, was put out the very next day. This is what he was referring to when he said 98.2% of people agreed with what he said. And he goes on and on about how Charlie Kirk was a Christian, despite whatever issues that people were saying about him. So Pastor Grant was not silent. He was only silent about the truth. That's what he was silent about. But when it came to saying things that would appease people, like he said, 98.2% of people agreed with him, he was all too happy to run his mouth about Charlie Kirk, like practically every other ministry and influencer. So all this talk about how there's a time to be silent, well, he was not silent. And who says that that was the time to be silent? If anything, that was the time to speak up. When everyone else was praising Charlie as a martyr, the establishment. And that would have been the perfect time for Pastor Grant to show everybody just how anti-establishment he really is. Right? He'll go against what everyone else is saying, despite all the backlash and all the attacks and all the criticism. But he ended up showing us that he's just as corrupt as the rest. Now let's hear some more of Pastor Grant falling in line with the Christian establishment.
When it comes to the doctrinal problems of Charlie Kirk, I stand by my decision this past week has not been the time to speak about that.
So there it is. He confirms that he was only silent about the bad side of Charlie Kirk, which is the only side. Right? But he said it was not the time to speak about the doctrinal problems with Charlie Kirk. So even from his perspective, he was still intentionally being silent about the whole story, which is not what King Solomon was talking about when he said that there's a time to speak and a time to be silent. Pastor Grant is essentially using that verse to justify lies of omission. A lie of omission is the intentional withholding of crucial information that results in a distorted perception of the truth. And that's what Pastor Grant presented in his podcast about Charlie Kirk. A distorted perception. There's a time to be silent about crucial information on Charlie Kirk. That's how Pastor Grant used that verse from God's word. This guy is a disgusting liar and hypocrite. And he says, last week was not the time to speak about Charlie Kirk's doctrinal problems. Now, why was that not the time? Because it was the most unpopular time. It was the most hostile time to speak about it, when everyone's emotions were high. That's why Good Fight Ministries unlisted their video about Charlie Kirk, about how he promoted Catholic ideas, and why they jumped on the Charlie Kirk train right after his death. So the time wasn't right really means it would have been too uncomfortable for me. Michael didn't want to face the backlash from the Charlie Kirk mob, many of which were probably already following him. So he was too scared to go against the grain, against the establishment, and lose potential subscribers and donors. That's what the establishment does, whether it's Christian, or political or whatever. But as many of you are probably aware, I'm not the least bit concerned by that. I was posting all kinds of stuff about Charlie Kirk's deceptions right after he was killed, when it was the most unpopular and hostile time to do so. Now, I first mentioned him as a promoter of the false light deception back in 2020 in my video about the return event, and mentioned him here and there in other videos. So Michael Grant's pretending like this refusal to talk about the problems with Charlie Kirk, he's acting like that was a decision rooted in biblical discernment. No, it was done purely from his own selfish motives. It was done out of self-preservation. It was the most comfortable route for him. He fears man more than he does God. If he was truly going to abide by that biblical principle and determine now is the time to be silent, well, then he would have said nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not just stayed silent about crucial details that matter. But obviously, he wanted to jump on the Charlie Kirk train and say some positive things about him to appease his fans and fans of Charlie Kirk, and hopefully get some more channel members. The only reason I said anything about it was because I saw how many channels were already making videos about him and praising him as this brave martyr of the faith. The first one I saw was from Ray Comfort. I did a post about it, and people absolutely lost their minds, which only made me dig deeper. But people like Pastor Grant, they get scared by backlash. That's why he made it a point to say 98% of people agreed with him. He said that because it matters to him. It matters to him how many people in the algorithm, in the statistics, agree with what he's saying.
Literally 98.2%. I just checked the stats on YouTube.
I had the opposite reaction. The backlash that I was getting only made me dig deeper into Charlie Kirk. I already knew that he was false, but I did some more research and found out a lot more stuff. And every video and post that I made about Charlie after that was done primarily because of the backlash that I was getting. It was a sign to me of just how dark and hardened the so-called Christian right really is. They're just as crazy as the woke left. Like this guy, Dirty's War, who went on countless outbursts on some of my videos and posts about Charlie and Erica Kirk. He's calling me a cult leader, saying that he reported me to TPUSA. These people are nuts. And the attacks I was getting only confirmed that I needed to talk about it more and look at Charlie Kirk even further. But Pastor Grant, who sees 98% of people agreeing with him as a flex, well, what's he got to say now? He enlisted this video that 98% of people agreed with because of my one or two comments. And he probably took down the first one too, the faith of Charlie Kirk. I can't find it on YouTube, only Spotify. So let me ask you, Pastor Grant, whose comments about Charlie Kirk aged better? Who had better discernment? According to you, it was a time to be silent about Charlie Kirk's doctrinal problems, but my videos and posts are still relevant. Yours aren't, right? I haven't taken down anything. You took them down because you're starting to realize that your take was foolish. You're starting to realize that it was in line with the Christian YouTube establishment that has no discernment that you talk about so much. Your take was anything but discerning. So maybe you're the one who needs a lesson in discernment. You don't fear God. You fear man. And that's what makes this second video of his even more ridiculous. Lesson in discernment. Who's he to give lessons in discernment to anyone? Anyway, let's hear some more of Pastor Grant's outdated and irrelevant lesson in discernment.
Just because I disagree with someone, and yes, I did disagree with Charlie Kirk on a variety of things. I said I didn't know that much about him, actually.
Didn't know that much about him, but that didn't stop him from making multiple videos about Charlie Kirk, calling him a Christian, did it? All Pastor Grant is doing here is admitting that he has no discernment whatsoever. He's admitting that he will publicly affirm popular figures with massive influence as Christians without knowing much about them. That's what he just said. And again, why? Because it was the popular thing to do. It was all anybody was talking about. And he jumped on board with the Christian establishment and called him a Christian. He knew that it would get him views, and he couldn't help himself. Well, here's another lesson in discernment for you, Pastor Grant. If you don't know much about someone, then you should either do your research first or stay quiet. You know, like Solomon said, there's a time to be silent. And I mean actually silent, completely silent. Not just silent on certain aspects that are actually quite important in understanding the whole picture. Since I don't know much about this guy, maybe I should wait before I say anything about him. That would have been exercising some discernment.
But just because I disagree with someone, that doesn't mean, just because someone is in error, that doesn't mean they're not saved. I know this might be a new thought for somebody, but just because a Christian is in error, just because a person says something wrong, or even if they do something that seriously is wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not saved.
Well, this might be a new thought for Pastor Grant, but before you publicly affirm someone as a Christian, especially when that someone has millions of followers, maybe you should do your research about the guy and determine if those errors and disagreements are actually kind of important. But this is a common theme with not just Pastor Grant, but many others. They'll use this term disagreement as a way of downplaying or justifying fellowship and affirmation of people who are controversial. Joe Schimmel and Chad Davidson did the exact same thing in their comments about Charlie Kirk after his death. They used the same word, disagreements, even though before that they were super important issues that they made multiple videos about, saying that the stuff that Charlie Kirk was promoting was part of the coming Antichrist kingdom. Mike Winger did the same thing to justify his fellowship with Michael Brown. Here's this post that he took down after all the stuff started coming out about Michael Brown. Hopefully you're seeing a theme, right? They have to take down stuff later. He said, "No, we don't agree with each other on everything." This is the all too common thing that they'll say. We don't agree with each other on everything, and that's okay. But what does Paul say? Be of multiple minds? No, he says in 1 Corinthians 1:10, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you disagree, no, agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be divided in mind, no, united in the same mind and the same judgment. But Mike Winger said his disagreements with Michael Brown made their fellowship sweeter. Disgusting. And again, how well did that age, right? And apparently, according to Mike Winger, promoting holy laughter and Kundalini spirit manifestations and fellowshipping with blatant false teachers like Bill Johnson and Todd White and Heidi Baker and Mike Bickle and Sid Roth, those are just disagreements. No big deal. And Pastor Grant, who has openly rebuked Mike Winger for a number of things, uses this same language, the same downplaying tactics to justify endorsing a false teacher and deceiver like Charlie Kirk as a brother in Christ. Pastor Grant has no more discernment than Mike Winger does. He's just as blind and undiscerning as the Christian establishment that he acts like he's so much better than.
Now, as for Charlie Kirk, someone left this comment about him, and I want to read my response because this sort of encapsulates the whole issue here. Someone wrote that I wasn't being discerning and that I shouldn't have spoken positively about Charlie because he believes in the false doctrine of the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is associated with the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, which I'm not even sure if that's correct. I haven't seen the clip.
So Michael Grant's willful ignorance just gets worse and worse. This guy might be a liar, but he definitely wasn't lying when he said that he didn't know much about Charlie Kirk. I'm sure many of you have seen this. This was back in 2020 at the CPAC meeting. Good Fight Ministries has mentioned this clip multiple times over the years, back when they were rebuking Charlie Kirk as a promoter of the Antichrist kingdom. Charlie Kirk says how thankful he was that Donald Trump understands the 7 mountains of cultural influence, a reference to the 7 Mountain Mandate. And I'm sure he mentioned it elsewhere, being friends with Lance Wallnau, who's been one of the most vocal proponents of the 7 Mountain Mandate the past 15 years or so. So understand a couple things. Michael Grant hadn't seen that clip, which has been around since 2020, which means he didn't bother to do even the most basic research into Charlie Kirk before opening his mouth and calling him a Christian to tens of thousands of viewers. But even worse, even after being told that that clip is probably out there somewhere, he still didn't bother trying to find it before making this second video on Charlie Kirk, doubling down on his ignorant opinion that he was a true Christian, and then having the audacity to rebuke people who criticized him for saying positive things about Charlie Kirk. This guy isn't just willfully ignorant. He's proudly ignorant. I don't know that much about Charlie Kirk. I don't know if he promoted the 7 Mountain Mandate, but how dare you suggest that I'm not being discerning, even though I'm admitting my lack of discernment and the fact that I don't know what I'm talking about.
Someone wrote that I wasn't being discerning because he believes in the false doctrine of the 7 Mountain Mandate. I'm not even sure if that's correct. I haven't seen the clip. I said I didn't know that much about him. I wasn't being discerning.
Pastor Grant admitted before tens of thousands of people that he was being informed about Charlie Kirk's promotion of the 7 Mountain Mandate, and confidently admits, not only had I not seen it, I still haven't bothered to go look it up before opening my mouth again. And yet he has the audacity to appeal to, there's a time to speak and a time to be silent. Well, let's hear some more of Pastor Grant's version of being silent.
But here's how I responded. I said, I never claimed that Charlie Kirk didn't have doctrinal problems. But you think, okay, this person who typed it, you think I'm not discerning because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids?
So there's that appeal to emotion that everyone was using. Murdered in front of his wife and kids. A bunch of people said the same to me when I was merely speaking the truth after Kirk was killed. They try every trick in the book to make you feel bad because all you did was tell the truth. They try to make you feel like you're an unfeeling, hard-hearted, horrible person. But then those same people will quote George Orwell about how much of a revolutionary act it is to tell the truth in a time of universal deceit. Very ironic. This is a play right out of the woke playbook, emotional manipulation. Just because so-called conservative Christians are using it doesn't suddenly make it right. Manipulation is manipulation, period. Now, if Paula White, a friend of Charlie Kirk, was murdered tomorrow by some woke activist, and tons of people were making videos about her, calling her a martyr of the faith and this and that, would Pastor Grant or anyone else say, well, now's not the time to speak up about my disagreements with her? Or would he feel compelled to speak up about it? What about Justin Peters or Good Fight Ministries or anyone else? Would they feel compelled to take the opportunity to convince her followers that she was a dangerous deceiver? Would they make videos and posts about the deception spreading in the wake of Paula White's murder? Well, either answer condemns them, right? Because if it's yes, then they're hypocrites. And if it's no, then they're cowards. And to all the people who said the same to me after Kirk was killed, how dare you say these things about a man who was just killed in cold blood in front of his wife and kids? Well, I still have yet to get a time frame on when exactly it would have been okay to say what I said about Kirk. A week? A month? 2 months? How long did I need to wait? They can't quantify it because they wouldn't be able to back up that number with anything logical, let alone biblical. These people cannot answer simple questions. And since Pastor Grant likewise said, now's not the time to speak up about my disagreements with Charlie Kirk, well, when is the time? Because he implies there that there is a time for him to speak up about those disagreements. So when is that going to be? Charlie Kirk was a manipulative, self-seeking, hypocritical, fake Christian who used God's name to build a multi-million-dollar empire for himself and who helped put hundreds of thousands, if not millions, on the road to hell, to eternal spiritual death. Where's your heart for those people? If you want to appeal to an emotional argument, mine wins out. You don't even win on that front. None of those people who appeal to an emotional argument seem to care about the eternal spiritual death that Charlie Kirk put countless people on, including his own children. The same little children that Pastor Grant and many others pretend to care about. They could not care less about his kids. They're just using his kids to emotionally manipulate and to deflect and defend against criticism of them. They use his kids and his widowed wife as a way to justify their own comments, positive comments about Charlie Kirk, which they only made to line their own pockets and soak up some of Charlie Kirk's base and hopefully get a seat at the TPUSA table. It's a sick, sick world that we live in. And if people are coming at you for calling Charlie Kirk a Christian, it's a very easy tactic, right? You want me to say something bad about the guy after he was just murdered in cold blood? How dare you? Where's your love? It's all a sham. It's a big sham from a bunch of hypocrites. None of these people actually care. Their accusations of you being hard-hearted and unloving, they're confessions. They're projections. Now, if I had mocked the guy or celebrated his death like the left was doing, then that'd be a different story. But I didn't do any of that, even though some people were interpreting it that way. All I did was say the truth about what Charlie Kirk promoted and believed. I simply said the truth when everyone else was telling comfortable lies. I'm the actual anti-establishment that Pastor Grant pretends to be.
You think I'm not discerning because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids?
Yes, that's absolutely one of the reasons that you're not discerning. Maybe if you had run the guy down, you wouldn't have been so in the dark about what Charlie Kirk promoted, like the Seven Mountain Mandate, and the kinds of wolves that he regularly associated with and promoted at not just TPUSA, but TPUSA Faith, the religious wing of TPUSA that he talked about with NAR leader Lance Wallnau. Maybe if you had run the guy down, you wouldn't have made a video that you now have to take down because it aged so poorly. And why did it age poorly? Because it wasn't discerning. If it was discerning, it would have stood the test of time, like my posts and videos have. If you were so discerning, Pastor Grant, why is this video unlisted? Because it wasn't discerning. It's pretty simple. So again, yes, you're not discerning, Pastor Grant, and you have no business giving anyone lessons in discernment. See, I did run the guy down, as you put it, right after he was murdered. And only because everybody and their grandmother was lifting this Pharisee up as a great martyr for Christ, that's the only reason I ran the guy down. My first thought after hearing that he was killed had nothing to do with making videos or posts. I only did that in response to the antichrist spirit among modern so-called Christianity that was nearly unanimously lifting him up as a faithful martyr. If practically every Christian ministry and influencer under the sun is going to tell millions of Christians that this guy was a brave martyr for Christ on the day of his murder, then people have every right to say the exact opposite on the day of his murder. Where in the Bible does it say, "Thou shalt not call out false teachers right after they die"? If people are going to spread deceptions about Charlie Kirk on the day of his murder, then any follower of Christ is perfectly within their biblical right to speak the truth about him on the day of his murder. And not just him, but his fake narcissist wife, who clearly didn't love him at all, because narcissists are incapable of love, and has to constantly fake tears to convince people that she is a grieving widow. God judged Charlie by giving him Erica. The monster that is Erica Kirk is part of Charlie Kirk's deceptive legacy. And it's a testament to his own complete lack of discernment that he became so close with a woman who is so blatantly a monster on the inside. This is who he chose to marry and have kids with. And I guarantee you, and I say this with full confidence before God and man, at least a part of Erica celebrated his death, because it meant that she would finally get the spotlight that she was always seeking. That's why she was so suspiciously happy so quickly after his death. That's why she was so quick to make public statements. She loved the grieving widow act, and it was an act. But I don't know where Christians get this idea that you're only allowed to say good things about someone after they die. In fact, not even Pastor Grant believes that. For example, here's a video that he did about Ozzy Osbourne the day after he died, talking about how satanic he was and suggesting how absurd it was that so many Christians were saying or implying that he was in heaven. Sound familiar? Well, here's some of what he had to say.
Ozzy Osbourne, if you don't know, news came out yesterday that he passed away. His nickname was the Prince of Darkness, okay? And his music, his lyrics, and the whole imagery of his band, Black Sabbath, I mean, it is overtly satanic. Okay, so why am I talking about this?
Yes, why are you talking about this, Pastor Grant? He just died. Why are you running the guy down right after he died?
Well, he died, and there's all sorts of people, including Christians, posting on social media, Ozzy, R.I.P., rest in peace. And that is, rest in peace is sort of code. It comes from the concept of, having peace with God and resting in God's grace. It's saying R.I.P. in a sense is saying that he is with the Lord.
So he ran the guy down right after he died because he saw a bunch of people, including Christians, imply that Ozzy was in heaven. Again, does this sound familiar, guys?
When he was younger, he was raised in a religious home. He was raised Roman Catholic. When he was a young person, when he was very young, he even considered going into ministry, if you can believe that. Now, when he became a teenager and got into music, he totally left all that behind. But in 1992, there was a New York Times article that said that Ozzy Osbourne in 1992 was a practicing Anglican. He was part of the Church of England, and he, at least at that time, professed to pray before each concert. Now, you can find video of Ozzy Osbourne saying that he believed in God. And then there's other video where he's contradicting that, and he says, well, he believes in himself or whatever. There's evidence that says he was part of this church, and then there's other times he says he doesn't go to church. So you can find him saying all sorts of different things.
So you can find him saying all sorts of different things, all these different things which Pastor Grant had no problem finding and talking about right after his death. So why was Pastor Grant so hip to Ozzy Osbourne's history? But when it came to Charlie Kirk, he claimed ignorance. I don't know that much about him. I don't know if that's true. I didn't see the clip. And didn't even bother looking up clips of stuff that other people were telling him about, like the Seven Mountain Mandate. It sure sounds like Pastor Grant had no problem running down Ozzy Osbourne the day after his death. He talks about how he grew up Catholic and then became Anglican. He knew about some New York Times article from the 1990s that said he was part of the Church of England and prayed before every concert. He knew about some of the things that he said about God and said you can find videos of him talking about God and other videos of him contradicting that. So it sure sounds like he knew quite a lot about Ozzy Osbourne. Enough to determine that he wasn't in heaven and imply that it was ridiculous for Christians to suggest that he was. But Pastor Grant couldn't be bothered to go look up and see the video of Charlie Kirk promoting the Seven Mountain Mandate, even after someone directly told him about it. And what was his reasoning again?
The book of Ecclesiastes says there's a time to speak and a time to remain silent.
Right, so it wasn't the time to speak about that. So it was a time to be silent about Charlie Kirk's doctrinal problems, as he put it, making light of his demonic deceptions. Promoting the Seven Mountain Mandate is just a doctrinal problem. So why wasn't it a time to be silent about Ozzy Osbourne and about how satanic and unchristian he was? Why was that a time to speak? Why was Pastor Grant so interested in running down Ozzy Osbourne the day after his death? And he found it absurd for Christians to suggest that he was in heaven and claim that he was a Christian based solely on a prior profession of faith. And yet that's exactly what people said about Charlie Kirk, including Pastor Grant, as we'll get into in a bit. Everybody called him a Christian because of his profession of faith. But listen to this chuckle that comes out of Pastor Grant as he says this.
Rest in peace is sort of code. It comes from the concept of, having peace with God and resting in God's grace. It's saying R.I.P. in a sense is saying that he is with the Lord.
So he couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of Ozzy Osbourne being at peace with God and in heaven.
Rest in peace is sort of code. Saying R.I.P. in a sense is saying that he is with the Lord.
Well, what's wrong with that, Pastor Grant? Are you saying the people who said that aren't discerning because they didn't run the guy down on the day of his death, like you said about people who criticized you for what you said about Charlie Kirk?
You think I'm not discerning because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids?
So is the difference that he was murdered in front of his wife and kids? Is that the deciding factor on whether or not you can run someone down on the day of their death and make a video about whether or not they're in heaven? Now, some can say, come on, he was an overtly satanic rock star living a horribly sinful life. He clearly wasn't a Christian. Well, no argument there. But the problem with that is that the Bible commands that we are to be more judgmental towards those who claim to be in the faith than those outside of it. We're supposed to be harsher, so to speak, toward false brethren and false teachers than we are to non-believers. Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 5, when Paul is saying to rebuke them sharply and in the presence of all, who's he talking about? He's not talking about the pagans or the Satanists. He's talking about unrepentant Christians and false teachers. And then 1 Corinthians 5:12, Paul says, "For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you." And in the verse before, He says that we're not even to eat with Christians who are not repentant of sin. But then later in chapter 10, verse 17, Paul says it's perfectly acceptable to eat with an unbeliever. Not that we should make a practice of it, but it's not a sin in and of itself to greet or have a meal with non-believers. But it is a sin to do the same with false and unrepentant brethren. So the Bible is clear that we're to practice stricter judgment toward those claiming to be in the church, claiming to be in God's house. Why? Because an outsider can't corrupt God's house. But someone like Charlie Kirk, even though he was obviously false, has a far more corrupting influence on God's house than someone like Ozzy Osbourne does. Good Fight Ministries is a perfect example of this, right? They wouldn't be caught dead with Ozzy Osbourne stuff in their church. But Charlie Kirk, that's a different story. All of a sudden, after his death, everything bad they ever said about him, about promoting the Seven Mountain Mandate and Catholicism and helping to usher in the Antichrist kingdom, after he died, that was all of a sudden just disagreements among Christians.
Everybody has their faults, and didn't agree with some of his theology for sure.
And yes, I did disagree with Charlie Kirk on a variety of things.
But I do believe that deep down he loved Jesus and was trying to do what was right in his mind.
And Chad talked about how friends of his knew Charlie Kirk personally. Do you think Chad would be friends with people who knew Ozzy Osbourne personally? Probably not. And even if he was, he certainly wouldn't have brought it up in a stream after Ozzy Osbourne died, trying to convince his viewers that he was getting more serious in his faith, like he did with Charlie. But Pastor Grant, like Good Fight Ministries, gets it backwards, as do the vast majority of professing Christians. They're harsher toward those outside the church, the ones who Paul says that we're not to judge. That's a sure sign of a corrupt church, when they're harsher toward outsiders than those inside. And I've said this before, corrupt organizations only judge their competitors, whether it's politics or business, right? The Democrats only point the finger at the Republicans and vice versa. They never care about the corruption in their midst, which is exactly the kind of corruption that Paul said we as Christians should care about first and foremost. We're not supposed to act like the world does. The world judges those outside of themselves. So if you're going to argue that it's okay to make a video about a famous person who died and say that they're not in heaven because they clearly weren't a believer, but then take issue with me or anyone else doing the same with Charlie Kirk, then you're being a hypocrite. You're clearly violating Scripture. But let's say for the sake of argument that, Pastor Grant only made that video because he saw, how many people were calling Ozzy a Christian, and he wanted to make a video warning about how you can't live an unrepentant life and still go to heaven. Well, that doesn't negate the obvious double standards and hypocrisy and violation of Scripture. But for the sake of argument, let's just set all that aside. Ozzy clearly wasn't a Christian, so this video is justified. Fine. Well, here's someone who did profess to be in the faith, and someone who, according to Pastor Grant, did profess the gospel, at least verbally, all the way until his death. Televangelist Jimmy Swaggart. And Pastor Grant did an even more thorough rundown of Jimmy Swaggart on the day of his death. Literally the day Jimmy Swaggart died, Michael did a video talking about all the horrible stuff that he did and taught. Calls him a corrupt televangelist, says he demanded absolute loyalty like a cult leader, a false prophet who claimed to hear direct revelation from God, taught false doctrine like sinless perfection, preached the prosperity gospel, talked about how he claimed that he understood the gospel better than the apostles, just goes on and on about all the bad stuff that he did and said. So again, Pastor Grant had no problem running down Jimmy Swaggart the day he died. But when it comes to Charlie Kirk, he wants to claim ignorance.
I'm not even sure if that's correct. I haven't seen the clip. I said I didn't know that much about him, actually.
Well, he sure knew a lot about Jimmy Swaggart, didn't he? And had no problem making a video the day of his death, telling everybody what a horrible, deceitful, false teacher he was. So again, what's the difference? Does it have to be murder for it to be wrong to run someone down on the day of their death and talk about how they're probably not in heaven? What about a car accident or cancer? Then is it okay? Do their wife and kids have to be present? Since that's what everyone was, talking about. Is that the difference maker? Because his wife and kids saw it happen? If his wife and kids weren't present, then would it have been okay to run him down on the day of his murder? Or is it because it was a public spectacle? Right? If he had been murdered privately, then would it have been okay? Is it because he was killed so young? Is that what made it too tragic to talk about? What exactly is the qualifier that makes it wrong in Charlie Kirk's case, but completely acceptable with Jimmy Swaggart? No one was ever able to answer that question when I asked this, after they criticized me for what I said about Charlie Kirk. I asked them the same questions, and no one was ever able to just give me a simple answer. Right? What specifically about Charlie Kirk's death made it so wrong to talk about how he was a false teacher, a false brother, a deceiver, etc.? According to Pastor Grant, it's clearly okay to run someone down on the day of their death and talk about all the bad stuff that they did, all the deceptions and false teachings that they promoted. And look at the unflattering thumbnail that he used. It's a real picture, but he clearly chose that as a way of mocking him, which I don't have a problem with in and of itself. I'm just highlighting the hypocrisy. Right? So on the day of his death, Pastor Grant was mocking Jimmy Swaggart. But I guess if Jimmy Swaggart had been murdered in front of his wife and kids, then he wouldn't have made this video. It sounds ridiculous, right?
Because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids?
What happened with Charlie Kirk exposed a massive amount of corruption in the hearts and minds of so many who profess the name of Jesus Christ. And here's the real difference. Here's why it's okay to do this with Jimmy Swaggart, but not with Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was loved by a lot more people. Jimmy Swaggart, sure, he had his loyal followers until the end, but by that time he had been involved in enough scandals and had said enough ridiculous things that it was safe to criticize him after he died. Charlie Kirk, on the other hand, despite being an obvious fraud and deceiver who the Lord was using to help build the false light movement that will ultimately culminate in the rise of the Antichrist, he was seen by millions as a brave warrior in the culture war against the left. He was a cultural hero because he was saving the West. He was a martyr for the West, not for Christ. And I'm telling you, a lot of people saw his death as a great threat to their own existence. That's why Spencer Smith was making these kinds of remarks right after it happened. Okay, Spencer Smith was melting down, and so were a lot of other people. It's fear. They see their precious Christian utopia under attack, and they're scared to death. That's why they got so emotional and defensive about Charlie's death. His death represented the potential downfall of the West. Be prepared. This is a sign of things to come. When much worse stuff starts happening, and it will, people are going to act out in much worse ways. Okay, it's eventually going to get physical. It's going to move beyond the realm of social media and get real physical real fast. And if you're standing in God's truth, they're going to see you as part of the problem, just like they see me as part of the problem for telling the truth about Charlie Kirk or anything else. So Swaggart was not seen as a hero of Western civilization like Charlie Kirk was. He had nowhere near the influence and following that Charlie Kirk had. Even if he had been murdered in cold blood in public, there would not have been protests around the world in response. People were protesting in Korea after Charlie Kirk died. That shows how influential he really was. His impact was global. So that's really the crux of it. Charlie Kirk was not safe to criticize because he was a hero of Western civilization. And the nature of his death, the graphic and public spectacle of it, it caused such emotions in people all over the world, unseen since probably the death of JFK. It just wasn't safe to criticize him, and people knew it, including Pastor Grant. And despite painting himself as a brave anti-establishment defender of the truth, Pastor Grant plays it safe, right? 98% of people agreed with what he said. You don't get that without playing it safe. And so out of fear, he gaslit himself into believing that no matter what the issues with Charlie Kirk were, they were just errors and disagreements among Christians. That's why he didn't bother looking up the clip of Charlie promoting the Seven Mountain Mandate. I guarantee you he didn't want to see it. It's like when Michael Brown chose not to look up the clip of Todd White's awful commentary on 2 Corinthians 5. I talked about that in From Bad to Worse Part 2. He didn't want to see it. It was too scary. And that's why Pastor Grant didn't run down Charlie Kirk on the day of his death. He didn't want to find too much evidence that would contradict the claim that he was a Christian and force him to say something that would get him major backlash. Right? He didn't want his back up against the wall. Right? He didn't want to see too much. He wanted to maintain the claim that Charlie Kirk was a Christian and block out any potential evidence that would contradict that claim. He willingly blinded himself to the evidence so that he could justify doubling down what he had already said in the first podcast, because he's too proud to admit that he was wrong. Think about it. His first podcast was September 11th, the very next day, and then the second podcast was 5 or 6 days later. He had plenty of time to do a little research about Charlie, but he didn't want to. He didn't want to find too much evidence that would contradict his first podcast, and so he willingly chose to stay in the dark. And how did that work out for him? He made at least 2 podcasts that he had to take down later because they became so outdated and irrelevant, because they were lacking in discernment. Anyway, let's get back to Pastor Grant's so-called lesson in discernment.
You think I'm not discerning because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids? If you think that's what I should have done last week, you're the one who lacks discernment. You're the one who lacks discernment.
Oh boy. Now he's telling other people that they lack discernment. You lack discernment if you think Pastor Grant should have done his homework about Charlie Kirk before running his mouth to tens of thousands of people. And again, who lacks discernment now, Pastor Grant? Who's the one that got scared over my comments and unlisted this video because he realized that what he said wasn't aging too well? Maybe if you had done that, you wouldn't have made 2 videos that you now have to hide because they've aged like milk. Maybe you're the one who lacks discernment.
As I said in my live stream from yesterday, coming out with that kind of response right after the assassination would have been counterproductive at the very least.
Why? Why would it have been counterproductive? Notice how he just says it, but doesn't explain why. He didn't think it was counterproductive to come out with a negative response about Jimmy Swaggart on the day of his death. He didn't think it was counterproductive to do the same with Ozzy Osbourne. In fact, he found it so productive that he included a Bible study along with it. What he really means by counterproductive is that it would have been inconvenient for him, right? He would have gotten too much backlash. He might have lost subscribers and paying members. It would have been counterproductive, quote unquote, to his ministry. That's what he means. He was focused on instant gratification, and he got it. But instant gratification tends to lead to long-term pain. That's how sin works. Ironically, this video, the video that he ended up making, was counterproductive because it's now unlisted. And he probably took down that other one too. That was wasted time, wasted podcasts, because everything he said in those is now completely irrelevant. The only relevance they have is exposing what a fraud and hypocrite he is.
What I did say is that Charlie was a Christian. Charlie was a Christian.
So there it is. Charlie was a Christian. That's the part that he tried to hide after my comments. And again, that's all I said to him. You called Charlie Kirk a Christian, to which he said false, which is a lie. That's a blatant lie. And that's why he blocked me and tried to bury the evidence. Now, I'll play it one more time because apparently Pastor Grant forgot what he said.
What I did say is that Charlie was a Christian. Charlie was a Christian. Charlie was a Christian. Charlie was a Christian.
So that's what he said, which he was so confident about that he repeated it, in case anybody didn't hear him in the back, I guess. So what I said wasn't false. He's the one who made false claims, including the one about where he says that he never made a claim about the state of Charlie Kirk's soul. Pastor Grant doesn't understand that calling someone a Christian when they die would be making a claim about where their soul is. Okay, calling Charlie Kirk a Christian and saying God took him home early would be making definitive statements about the state of his soul. This guy is an absolutely blind liar and manipulator. But after all the dust has settled and, he's been covering TPUSA and probably learning a lot more about just how corrupt and ecumenical of an organization it is, he's probably a lot less confident about Charlie Kirk being a Christian. Otherwise, why would he unlist this video?
And I said he clearly articulated the gospel, which he did.
So that's all Pastor Grant went on, apparently, in determining that Charlie Kirk is in heaven, which was the determination that he made, despite saying that he never made a claim about the state of his soul. Where do Christians go? They go to heaven, right? And where do non-believers, as he said about Ozzy Osbourne, where do they go? They go to hell, right? Not right away, but, later on. And where do false teachers like Jimmy Swaggart and Paula White go? They go to hell. So despite his claim that he doesn't make claims about the state of people's souls, he absolutely does. And Pastor Grant concluded that Charlie Kirk is in heaven, right? Remember, he said sometimes God takes people home early before they fully go off the rails. And the only thing that he based that conclusion on was hearing Charlie Kirk articulate the gospel, as if the devil himself couldn't articulate the gospel. Words are all that matter, according to Pastor Grant. Now, that would be bad enough, except that he's not even consistent with that bad standard. He's very selective in how he applies it. For example, when it came to Jimmy Swaggart, who Michael Grant was all too eager to run down on the day of his death and tell everybody how bad he was, he said preaching the gospel wasn't enough. Listen.
His fans are going to say, hey, that's not true. Jimmy Swaggart preached the gospel. He was a faithful gospel preacher. And did he preach the gospel at times? Sure. Sort of like with Billy Graham. These men did preach the gospel. Jimmy Swaggart, at times, he did preach the gospel, but other times, he said things that are contrary So I don't doubt that there are people out there who heard the gospel for Jimmy Swaggart or from Jimmy Swaggart. I don't doubt there's somebody listening right now who said, I was saved out of his ministry. I heard the gospel from him and I was saved by listening to Jimmy Swaggart. I don't doubt that that's the case. It has been said that God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. So I'm sure there are people, plenty of people, who appreciate many of the things that Jimmy Swaggart said and did. But when you look at the scandals, and especially the strange doctrine, many, if not most pastors understand that Jimmy Swaggart's ministry was at best problematic, and at worst, just flat out a ministry that should probably be marked and avoided.
So Jimmy Swaggart preached the gospel enough to where people could have been saved by hearing his preaching. And yet, Michael still did a video about him on the day of his death, covering his scandals and his heretical doctrine, and says to mark and avoid him. Right? He's a ministry to mark and avoid. Why? Because there were so many other things that he said and did that were completely contrary to that gospel that he preached, that betrayed his true intentions. Right? This is a basic concept. Titus 1:16, they profess to know God, but deny him by their works. You cannot simply go off what someone says about Jesus. Merely preaching the gospel is obviously not enough in and of itself. And after nearly 2,000 years of the gospel being spread and things like the Nicene and Apostles' Creed being recited for centuries, any fraud can memorize the gospel and articulate basic Christian doctrine. And apparently Pastor Grant understands that concept when it comes to Jimmy Swaggart, who he says preached the gospel. But when it came to Charlie Kirk, suddenly articulating the gospel was enough.
I said he clearly articulated the gospel, which he did. Clearly articulated the gospel.
So what? Didn't Jimmy Swaggart articulate the gospel?
And did he preach the gospel at times? Sure.
So yes, he did. So why wasn't that enough, Pastor Grant?
Jimmy Swaggart, at times he did preach the gospel, but other times, he said things that are contrary.
Oh, I see. So he said things contrary to it. He preached the gospel, but then also said and did things contrary to it. Things such as?
But when you look at the scandals, and especially the strange doctrine, many, if not most pastors understand that Jimmy Swaggart's ministry was at best problematic.
So when you look at the scandals and the strange doctrine, well, wouldn't the Seven Mountain Mandate be strange doctrine, Pastor Grant? Yeah, it would. What about promoting Catholicism as a legitimate form of Christianity? Would that be strange doctrine? What about fellowshipping with Paula White and Mark Driscoll and Lance Wallnau and countless other false teachers? Would that be behavior that would contradict the gospel that he articulated? Yeah, it would. As 2 John 9-11 says, if you even greet those who do not abide in the teaching of Christ, you share in their evil deeds. And Charlie did far more than just greet them. He partnered with them in ministry with TPUSA Faith. And if Pastor Grant had the discernment to run down Charlie Kirk on the day of his murder, maybe he would have found out some of this evidence that Charlie lived a life completely contrary to the gospel that he articulated, like Jimmy Swaggart. And remember, he was given evidence by someone in the comments about the Seven Mountain Mandate, and he completely disregarded it. Didn't do any further research, didn't bother going and looking up the clip, didn't bother giving it any deeper thought. All he heard was Charlie articulate the gospel, and that was enough for him to proclaim him as a Christian. He didn't have the discernment to think, well, if he promoted the Seven Mountain Mandate, there's probably some other big issues too, because red flags typically don't fly solo. Maybe I should hold off on making a determination about him. But no, articulating the gospel was enough, even though it wasn't enough when it came to Jimmy Swaggart. And notice what he says here.
Many, if not most, pastors understand that Jimmy Swaggart's ministry was at best problematic and at worst just flat out a ministry that should probably be marked and avoided. Many, if not most, pastors
understand. More proof that he goes with the flow. He goes with the consensus, with what's safe. Most pastors agree that Jimmy Swaggart was bad, so therefore it's safe for me to say the same about him. But most pastors were not agreeing that Charlie Kirk was bad, so therefore it wasn't safe for him to say that about Charlie Kirk. But I thought this guy was anti-establishment, right? I thought he went against the grain.
So, his fans are going to say, hey, that's not true. Jimmy Swaggart preached the gospel. He was a faithful gospel preacher.
So fans of Jimmy Swaggart are going to say that he preached the gospel. Well, ironically, that's what fans of Charlie Kirk said about him, that he preached the gospel. How dare you say such bad things about him after he's been murdered? He was murdered for preaching the gospel. And yet here, Michael Grant is making a video on the day of Jimmy Swaggart's death, talking about his scandals and his false doctrine, and insisting that preaching the gospel is not enough to get you into heaven. And it's precisely those fans of Charlie Kirk that Michael Grant, Mr. Anti-Establishment, was trying to appease when he called him a Christian. That's why preaching or articulating the gospel was enough in that case, because he wanted to appeal to Charlie Kirk's fan base. But here's more evidence that Michael Grant fully understands that articulating the gospel is not in and of itself enough. This is from his Ozzy Osbourne video, part of the Bible study that he included along with it.
I think it's because a lot of people have been brought up in a church. Maybe it's a Rick Warren style church where people are told, they're instructed, as long as you say the sinner's prayer, as long as you repeat these words, as long as you make a profession of faith, you are automatically saved.
Well, that's essentially the logic that he applied to Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk articulated the gospel. He made a profession of faith. Therefore, he was a Christian. He was saved. He's in heaven. God took him home.
But the free grace position can be taken too far into cheap grace or easy believism, where as long as you repeat these words or just give mental assent to the gospel, then, hey, that's good enough.
Well, it was good enough for you, Michael, when it came to Charlie Kirk. Your only evidence that Charlie Kirk was a true Christian was that he articulated the gospel, which is just repeating words, like you said about people who believe in cheap grace.
Charlie was a Christian. He clearly articulated the gospel.
Pastor Grant applied the cheap grace standard, the logic behind it, to Charlie Kirk. He's a Christian because he said the right words. That's what articulation is, saying words.
James 2:19 is very clear that even the demons believe. I mean, they give mental assent to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. I mean, Satan knows that Jesus died and rose again. He believes that. He gives mental assent to the truth of that. He knows it's true. But Satan doesn't love Jesus. He's not following Jesus. And he doesn't have faith or trust in Jesus.
Yes, Satan and the demons know the gospel. They know that Jesus is the Son of God. The demons that Jesus himself cast out affirmed that he was the Son of God. They knew it so deeply that they were scared that he came to punish them early, right before the appointed time. So we see how a profession of faith, or an articulation of the gospel, as Pastor Grant said of Charlie Kirk, is utterly meaningless in and of itself. Yes, it's required. You have to make a profession of faith, but it has no value in and of itself in determining the true Christians from the frauds. If even the demons and Satan himself know that Jesus is the Son of God who died and rose again, then it's completely useless as a determining factor about the genuineness of someone's faith. And what did Charlie Kirk say in that viral clip that everybody, including Good Fight Ministries, used to prove that he was a true Christian?
That Jesus Christ was a real person. He lived a perfect life. He was crucified, died, and rose on the third day, and he is Lord and God over all.
Weren't those the very things that Pastor Grant just admitted Satan and the demons affirm?
James 2:19 is very clear that even the demons believe. I mean, they give mental assent to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God.
And he is Lord and God over all.
I mean, Satan knows that Jesus died and rose again.
He was crucified, died, and rose on the third day.
He gives mental assent to the truth of that. He knows it's true. But Satan doesn't love Jesus. Even the demons believe.
So Charlie Kirk affirmed nothing more than what Satan and the demons affirm. Giving mental, verbal assent to that truth doesn't mean that you love Jesus, right? As Pastor Grant just said. Well, if that's true with Satan and the demons, or Jimmy Swaggart, or Ozzy Osbourne, who he was also applying this standard to, then it's also applicable in Charlie Kirk's case. What proof is there outside of his profession of faith, which Pastor Grant just admitted is not enough? What proof is there that Charlie Kirk loved Jesus? Was it his multi-million-dollar mansion, his promotion of countless false teachers, his fellowship with Catholics, his promotion of the Seven Mountain Mandate, his statement that we need a strong Mormon church in America again? Or maybe those were all things that contradicted the gospel he articulated. When it came to Charlie Kirk, right after he was killed, and it was most popular to speak positively about him, giving verbal assent to basic gospel truths that even the demons grasp and affirm was enough for Pastor Grant to conclude that Charlie Kirk was a Christian and rebuke people who criticized him for doing so. This is why he unlisted the video, guys. He forgot what he had said and panicked when I reminded him. But instead of owning up to what he said, he blocked me and tried to hide the evidence like a coward. In fact, he admitted that that's what he would do if it turned out he was wrong about Charlie Kirk. Listen to this.
I've told the few people who left comments on my podcast about the faith of Charlie Kirk, that was the first podcast I did. I said, if you can link me to one video and give me the timestamp where Charlie called Mormons brothers in Christ, or where he affirmed the gospel of Rome, if you can prove to me that he actually did that, then I will take the podcast down. I will take the podcast down.
So there it is. That's all he would do. Take the podcast down. He won't acknowledge he was wrong. He won't admit that he was the real one who lacked discernment about Charlie Kirk. He would just take the podcast down. He admits that when he's wrong about important stuff, he just sweeps it under the rug and moves on like nothing happened. He said it himself. He's too proud to admit that he's wrong because he knows that he looks foolish for making multiple podcasts about Charlie Kirk, calling him a Christian, and then telling people that they have no discernment for accusing him of not doing enough research on Charlie Kirk first. But what's funny is that he said he would only take the podcast down if someone sent him clips of Charlie calling Mormons brothers in Christ or affirming the false gospel of Catholicism. But he ended up taking it down just because of my one or two comments. Isn't that strange? I didn't mention anything about Charlie fellowshipping with Mormons and Catholics. All it took was me mentioning him being friends with Paula White and having a female pastor, and how absurd it was for him to call Charlie Kirk a Christian, which made him panic enough to immediately strawman what I said and start going off on tangents that had nothing to do with what I said, which then finally made him take it down and block me. He knew that he was digging himself a big hole.
I said, if you can link me to one video and give me the timestamp where Charlie called Mormons brothers in Christ, or where he affirmed the gospel of Rome. If you can prove to me that he actually did that, then I will take the podcast down.
So do my homework for me, guys. If you have more discernment than I have, send me the evidence, and I'll take this down and say nothing else about it. Well, this might be completely moot now, since he already took down the podcast. But here's some of the evidence that he was asking people to provide him.
As an evangelical who loves Catholics, I love that you're doing it, but let me just edit what
Here's
you
the
say.
but. Here's the
no,
but.
No, it's a big one. You didn't catch it, Michael. Yeah. It's that your goal should be to bring people to Jesus, not Catholicism.
Yo, hold on. No. What's the difference? I don't think. Hold on.
I'm not saying that they're contradictory. Bringing people to Catholicism is fine, of course, great, terrific. Bringing people to Catholicism is fine, of course, great, terrific. Yeah, and look, to be very clear, like 9 out of 10 of Catholic dogmas evangelicals hold. 9 out of 10, right? Yeah. And that is why I believe Catholics are Christian.
If you can link me to one video where he affirmed the gospel of Rome, then I will take the podcast down.
So if Charlie Kirk believed Catholics are Christian and said that it was fine, great, and terrific to bring people to Catholicism, and that Jesus and Catholicism are not contradictory, then wouldn't that be affirming the gospel of Rome, Pastor Grant? Yeah, it would. And then here's the tweet of him saying that he'd be the new Pope's biggest fan if he helped usher in the golden age of Christianity by defending Western values. But Pastor Grant took the podcast down without me showing him any of that. Interesting. And what's also interesting is that what Charlie said about Catholics, that he has disagreements with some of their doctrine but still considers them Christians, that's exactly what Pastor Grant said about Charlie Kirk. Charlie used the same faulty, unbiblical logic to justify his fellowship with Catholics. So I'm confused. Had he already seen that clip or some other damning evidence but forgot to take it down? And then my comment jogged his memory? Or was my comment simply enough for him to realize that what he was saying about Kid Rock and Paula White completely contradicted what he had said about Charlie Kirk? Well, who knows? Because this guy just deletes things and blocks people, like Good Fight Ministries and Spencer Smith do. But part of me tends to think that deep down, he realized that the things that he was accusing Paula White and Kid Rock of, Charlie Kirk was guilty of too. Like this.
We all know who Paula White is. She violates clear passages of Scripture. First of all, she lives a lifestyle, just a filthy rich lifestyle.
Well, so did Charlie Kirk. At the time of his death, TPUSA was making nearly $100 million a year, and he lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion, between $5 and $6 million. And of course, people went right to the "he wasn't a pastor" excuse. But where in the Bible does it say living a lavish lifestyle is only prohibited for pastors and teachers? Where? I asked multiple people when I made a post about this, and all they were capable of giving me were deflecting questions and straw man arguments. They could not tell me what the biblical basis was that only prohibited pastors and teachers from living a lavish lifestyle. Just because it would be worse for a pastor or teacher, right? Just because it would incur harsher judgment doesn't mean that they're the only ones not allowed to do it. For example, murder is illegal no matter what age you are. But if you're young enough, you might not get as harsh a sentence. But that doesn't mean, well, if you're under 18, it's okay for you to murder, right? No, it just means that if you're over 18, you'll probably get a harsher sentence. Stricter judgment upon one group doesn't suddenly mean the other group is permitted freedom to do it. And what about the rich man who Christ told to sell all his possessions? Was he a teacher of the law? And did Christ say, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich pastor or teacher to enter the kingdom of heaven? No, he said a rich man. And the command in Hebrews 13:5 to keep your life free from the love of money was to all believers, not just pastors and teachers. In fact, that's made explicitly clear just a couple verses later when he says, remember your leaders, meaning he's not addressing the leaders in this letter. This is not a pastoral epistle. So Charlie Kirk was guilty of the same lavish lifestyle that Paula White is. In fact, he probably picked up some tips from her on how to make money in God's name. Okay, there's a reason why they were friends. Now, here's some more of Pastor Grant's rebuke of Charlie Kirk's friend, Paula White.
But she openly defies the word of God, passages like 1 Timothy 2:12, which says, I do not permit a woman to teach. This is the Apostle Paul in a pastoral epistle saying that women are not to teach, they are not to be pastors. And I know what charismatics like to say. They say that that passage is just cultural. But no, again, the context is a pastoral epistle, and Paul roots his argument in the creation mandate, in the created order that Adam was formed first and then Eve. So that's the biblical doctrine of male headship. Paula flagrantly rejects this.
Well, guess who else rejects this and openly defies God's word? One of the co-pastors of Charlie's former church, Dream City Church in Phoenix, Arizona, Pastor Angel Barnett. And you see it right there at the top, senior leadership. So one of Charlie's very own former pastors openly defies the word of God, which means Charlie had no problem with this open defying of the word of God and therefore shared in that evil. And he actually mentioned the Barnetts and Dream City Church to Lance Wallnau when he was talking about the birth of TPUSA Faith.
We started something called Freedom Square. It's the first Tuesday of every month at Dream City Church, formerly Tommy Barnett's church, now Luke Barnett's church. It used to be Phoenix First, now it's Dream City Church.
Good.
There are some good pastors out there. Rob McCoy, Jack Hibbs, James Cadiz, Pastor Jurgen, the Barnetts, and they've warmly embraced me, and they want to be part of this kind of coalition. You know these people. That's why you're chuckling. And the Barnetts, you know these people.
So the Barnetts were one of these early ones to get on board with TPUSA Faith to help build this movement that's now at the point that it is in 2026. And I briefly mentioned this in my comment on Michael Grant's video. My first comment, I said Charlie went to a church with a female pastor. Maybe he went and looked that up, and that's what made him block me and take the video down. I don't know. But in his initial podcast on September 11th, Pastor Grant said Charlie Kirk was part of Calvary Chapel. I don't know where he got that idea. Maybe he saw clips of him at Jack Hibbs' church, which he visited quite often, and just assumed that that was his church. I don't know. But he clearly didn't do his homework about Charlie Kirk before doing these podcasts. He couldn't wait to make them and get views. He just had to talk about it as soon as possible.
I said I didn't know that much about him.
Well, that's obvious, Pastor Grant. You not only said that you didn't know much about him, you proved it with your actions. You had no clue what you were talking about. He didn't even know what church Charlie Kirk went to. So again, who's the one who lacked discernment, Pastor Grant? But you're going to tell other people that they lack discernment because they rightly told you that it was wrong to make positive statements about someone who was so obviously a deceiver?
You think I'm not discerning because I won't run the guy down right after he's murdered in front of his wife and kids? If you think that's what I should have done, you're the one who lacks discernment. You're the one who lacks discernment.
Well, maybe if you had run the guy down like you should have, and like you did with Jimmy Swaggart and Ozzy Osbourne, you could have found out what church he went to. If you had done your homework, you wouldn't have made such foolish claims that you now have to hide because they were so blatantly wrong and hypocritical. And it's funny how Pastor Grant mentioned how female pastors are common within the charismatic community. Well, Dream City Church is part of the charismatic tradition. On their website, they talk about their history being rooted in the Azusa Street revival, which was basically an early version of the Toronto Blessing with all kind of holy laughter manifestations. Azusa Street is one of the most commonly cited events by leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation. They look to Azusa Street as an important part of their history as charismatics. So Charlie Kirk's church not only had a female senior pastor, or at least a co-senior pastor, but they're part of the charismatic tradition of promoting demonic manifestations, being drunk in the spirit, holy laughter, and all the rest. It says on their website, emphasizing spiritual gifts, divine healing. And then after he died, they invited Christ-denying Brandon Tatum up on stage to talk about Charlie. So in addition to everything else, they also have no problem welcoming blatant heretics who deny the deity of Christ into their church. Charlie's entire life was in defiance of God's word.
Well, if you love your neighbor, you're not going to scam them for $100,000. And yes, I'm talking to Paula White right now. If Paula White really loved people, if she loved her people, she wouldn't be manipulating them and pressuring them for money when she lives in a mansion and flies in private jets. Make no mistake about it, I'll just say it, Paula White is evil. She is an evil, adulterous, false prophet, and Kid Rock isn't much better. But in our twisted world today, these people are the new face of celebrity Christianity.
Yeah, and guess who helped make Paula White one of the faces of celebrity Christianity? Charlie Kirk, who featured her at TPUSA events. So Charlie Kirk promoted evil, according to Pastor Grant. Right? He called Paula White an evil, adulterous, false prophet. And she was doing all this stuff when Charlie was alive. In fact, right before the podcast, The Faith of Charlie Kirk, that he did the day after he died, he did a podcast about one of Paula White's scams. Okay, so she was doing all this stuff when he was alive. It's not like she suddenly got bad after he died. He had no problem with all the scams and all the evil stuff that she was doing when he was alive. And he rebukes Paula White for living in a mansion. Well, so did Charlie Kirk.
And now you got famous YouTubers, starting to work with TPUSA, and now they're starting to compromise in some of these same areas.
Listen to how ridiculous he's starting to sound now. This is why he took down the Charlie Kirk video. He's saying that merely working with TPUSA, the organization that Charlie Kirk founded, is spiritually compromising. But founding the entire organization is somehow forgivable to Pastor Grant. Founding the very organization that he says is so bad that to even associate with it is to spiritually compromise. Well, that's just an error or disagreement.
And yes, I did disagree with Charlie Kirk on a variety of things. Just because someone is in error, that doesn't mean they're not saved.
Do you hear how ridiculous he sounds? And I bet deep down he started realizing how ridiculous he was sounding, and that's why he took down those videos. Again, this was the video that I commented on. And my comments were highlighting the blatant inconsistencies between this video and the ones that he did on Charlie Kirk. And he probably started realizing, uh-oh, I'm getting myself caught here.
This stuff needs to get called out. We need to warn the flock and nip it in the bud and make sure nobody is listening to Paula White, because she has more influence now than ever.
Yes, thanks in large part to Charlie Kirk, who promoted and platformed her, who put her on one of the largest Christian stages in the country.
Being part of the Trump administration's White House Office of Faith.
Yes, and she talked about this at a TPUSA event in 2021, where they introduced her as a believer in Christian Trumpism.
You're a believer in Christian Trumpism. We're going to have to ask you about that. That's a great term, Christian Trumpism. I'm sure a lot of people in this room, raise your hand if you like some Christian Trumpism. Right?
I've had the great privilege of knowing President Trump for 21 years. And to tell you a little bit about him, I got a phone call about 21 years ago, and they said, Mr. Trump's on the line. I was like, sure. And if the apprentice was there, I'd been like, you're fired. And It wasn't. So I got on. He said, "You're fantastic. You've got the it factor." I said, "Oh, sir, we call that the anointing."
And you can go watch the rest in the compilation that I did about that. But her relationship with Trump goes all the way back to the year 2000. That's clearly one of the reasons why Charlie Kirk hooked up with her in the first place, because of her long relationship with Trump. He wanted to get to know Trump's spiritual advisor because Charlie, like Paula White, preached the MAGA doctrine, which was the title of one of Charlie's books, because he also believed in Christian Trumpism. And if you believe in Christian Trumpism, that means you put Donald Trump before Christ, right? In that term, Christian Trumpism, Christian is simply the modifier, the modifying adjective. Trumpism is the main noun. Trump Christianity would be bad enough, but at least with that, Christianity would be the main noun and Trump would just be the modifier. But Christian Trumpism makes Trump the main thing, and Christian is just the modifying adjective. And I guess you can have other forms of Trumpism.
Raise your hand if you like some Christian Trumpism. Right?
This is dangerous stuff. She is a clear grifter and a con artist, a charlatan.
I've been called that before. And
people like Paula White absolutely need to be marked and avoided for their heresy and false teaching.
Well, if it's dangerous stuff today in 2026, then it was still dangerous stuff back in 2021. She was every bit the evil, grifter, charlatan, and false prophet back in 2021 that she is today. But remember, Pastor Grant said TPUSA is dangerous at this point. He knew that wasn't true, and that's why he panicked and took down the video. And here's where his rebuke of Paula White and others reached an absurd level of hypocrisy.
And listen, every person involved in this ecumenical conference is guilty right there along with Paula White. And that's based on 2 John 9 through 11.
Now, here's the conference that he was talking about, Unleashed 2026 conference. And he says everyone involved in this conference is guilty of the very same evil that Paula White is guilty of. Grifting, false teaching, scamming, manipulating, etc. They're all automatically guilty of her evil simply for being associated with her. Right? He didn't go into any specific sins that they've committed themselves. He just said they're all guilty with her of her evil.
Guilty right there along with Paula White.
Are you starting to see why all it took was my comments for him to take down the video? If everyone involved in this conference, pay attention, Pastor Grant, if you're listening. If everyone involved in this conference is automatically guilty of all the evil things that Paula White says and does, which is the correct application of 2 John that we looked at earlier, then so is Charlie Kirk. I shouldn't have to explain this any further. And clearly I didn't to Pastor Grant because he took down the video. He knew what I was saying. He knew the implications of it. Charlie Kirk was friends with her, featured her at TPUSA events. He didn't just get involved with her in a conference. No, he put conferences and events on and then invited her to them. And not just her, but dozens and dozens of other false teachers just like her, including Mark Driscoll, who the other day Michael Grant rebuked Frank Turek for fellowshipping with. He posted this picture and said, first Frank Turek defended Kirk Cameron, and now he's teaming up with Mark Driscoll? Seriously? Well, I want to ask you the same thing, Pastor Grant. Seriously? You're going to rebuke Frank Turek for teaming up with Mark Driscoll when Charlie Kirk teamed up with him years ago?
I said I didn't know that much about him.
And then he says, it really does seem like the Christian establishment on YouTube cares nothing about sound doctrine, only fame and networking. This is insane. I cannot fathom the blind hypocrisy. The amount of evil that Pastor Grant must have committed in his heart over the years to be this blind is astonishing. I asked at the beginning, who was more Christian establishment than Charlie Kirk? Well, Pastor Grant just confirmed that in his own words. If teaming up with people like Mark Driscoll means you're part of the Christian establishment, then so was Charlie Kirk, even by Pastor Grant's own standards. Charlie Kirk cared nothing about sound doctrine, according to Pastor Grant, right? By his standards. If you team up with Mark Driscoll, you don't care anything about sound doctrine. And then here's a post he made calling out Melissa Dougherty for being too soft on Bethel. And he says here, yes, she critiques them, but she treats them as brothers in error. Well, that's funny. What did he say about Charlie Kirk again?
Charlie was a Christian. Charlie was a Christian. But just because a Christian is an error, Christian is an error.
Ah, a Christian in error. That's how Pastor Grant treated Charlie Kirk last year. And still did as of March 2026, right? Because he doubled down in his response to me. God took him home early. And he implied that he's a Christian, just not a good one. So he characterized Charlie Kirk in the exact same way that Melissa Dougherty is treating Bethel. Brothers in error. And Charlie Kirk went to the same kind of church that Bethel is. Right? They may not be as well known, but they're part of the charismatic Azusa Street revival tradition. Believes in all the same stuff. And some of you might recognize the person who responded here. That's Laura of Magical Mystery Church. Hey, Laura, were you not aware that Pastor Grant called Charlie Kirk a Christian and treated him as a brother in error? And I wonder, since he's supposedly against female pastors, I wonder if he would have a problem with your promotion of Pastor Roberta. All these people are just hypocrites. Blind hypocrites headed toward a big ditch. It's interesting how they all end up being connected. Pastor Grant, Laura, John Brisson of We Read the Documents, Spencer Smith, probably Alexandra. It seems they're all forming their own little network. Hopefully more on them later.
There's a lady on her name is, what is her name here? I got it right here. Probably Alexandra. I'm sure you probably have heard of her. She said a lot of her friends getting caught up into it. She asked me to, talk about it. And I think I will.
But anyway, I think we can safely say that Pastor Grant, despite his chastisement of people who criticized his positive comments about Charlie Kirk, he's the one who lacks discernment.
Paula White is not a pastor. She is a con artist. Kid Rock is not a Christian. He is a reprobate concerning the faith. And TPUSA, honestly, by promoting these people as Christians, well, it's very dangerous, to say the least.
Father, I just thank you right now. We come to you in the name of Jesus, and I thank you for every woman that is here, every young girl.
It's very dangerous, to say the least.
Charlie Kirk was a great man of God, and he was a good friend. I've known him for over 10 years. I was just with him in the White House a few weeks ago.
Very dangerous, to say the least.
I've spoken over 60 churches in the last year, and I realized that there is a real movement. We want 1,000 Dietrich Bonhoeffers. We're not going to say like we're going to create them. I want to find them and encourage them. That's it. Find and encourage. Find and encourage. That's it.
We organize and we activate.
Find and encourage. Find and encourage.
Organize, activate.
Find and encourage.
So I believe in you guys.
Find and encourage. That's it.
God's going to do something great with your very life.
And we want to export this and empower and encourage pastors to do it for themselves.
And that allows us to have a great conservative agenda to see our great-great-great-grandchildren live out the proud American dream and the God dream.
Well said.
Very dangerous.
Go to your pastor and say, I want to have Turning Point Faith come to my church. And their pastor will say, no. And then you should ask again.
Charlie was a Christian. You're the one who lacks discernment. Remember, these are lessons in discernment. Lessons in discernment.
So for all his talk about discernment, Michael Grant is clearly the one who lacks it. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says that the natural man cannot understand the things of God because they are spiritually discerned. In other words, through the help of the Holy Spirit. Only the Spirit of God can understand the things of God. But all Pastor Grant and people like him, Spencer Smith, Good Fight Ministries, etc., they can only see the most obvious surface-level problems. Jimmy Swaggart, Ozzy Osbourne, Paula White, Kid Rock. They only have surface-level discernment. That's why Pastor Grant determined that Charlie Kirk was a Christian solely on the fact that he could articulate the gospel, even though he hypocritically doesn't apply that standard to others. I'm sure Paula White has articulated the gospel at some point too. How many countless false teachers, Kenneth Copeland, Bill Johnson, have articulated the gospel at some point? This is an absurd standard that he only applied to Charlie Kirk. True discernment is being able to see the brick wall before you run into it. Okay, discernment is not running into a brick wall because you're blind and then going oops and changing course because you're forced to and continuing on like it's no big deal. Like Laura of Magical Mystery Church did with Mike Winger. She ignored all the red flags, all the warning signs, ignored the warning that I gave prior to that. And then when he comes out promoting Charlie Kirk as a martyr, she goes, oops, he had me fooled. Oh, well. Yeah, why were you fooled, Laura? Because you were blind. And if anyone gets angry at you because you had the discernment to say the truth about Charlie Kirk when it was unpopular, understand that they're mad at you because they lack the Spirit of God, and they're angry at you for making judgments that they're unable to make. Their conscience is jealous. How dare you make a judgment that I can't make? It's offensive to them. Like Joseph's dreams were offensive to his brothers. It's really just another form of the woke left getting offended at conservatives for speaking the truth about gender issues. They get mad because they think that that's something they're not allowed to judge or determine. Well, this is just another form of that. Instead of you're not allowed to say who's a man or a woman, it's you're not allowed to say who's in heaven. So when they attack you for speaking the truth, remember Jesus' words. Rejoice and be glad, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Remember the examples of the prophet Micaiah or Elijah. Truth rarely has numbers on its side. It was the case in the Old Testament, it's the case now. If truth was popular, Jesus wouldn't have said that the path of destruction was broad and that many would find it. Now, we'll finish off with this. Here's a comment that Pastor Grant left on his Ozzy Osbourne video. I just had to ban a professing Christian who insisted Ozzy is in heaven as he practically started to curse me out using a variation of the F-bomb. So he got mad, like I said. I told him he was proving my point, and he flipped out, so yes, cheap grace is a problem. That kind of behavior will not be tolerated on this channel. Now, here's what he's doing. He's making this public statement about how he had to block a crazy person who was flipping out on him and cursing, and who probably wasn't a true Christian based on his behavior. Now, we'll assume all that's true. What's the impression that he's giving with this comment? He only blocks people when they act like this, when they go ballistic and curse. That kind of behavior will not be tolerated on this channel, he says. It gives the impression that the only thing that isn't tolerated, the only reason he would ban or block someone, is because they use explicit language or something along those lines. This is a form of lying. Even though he's technically telling the truth and just saying what happened, he's still lying because he's presenting a false perception of how he deals with criticism. Manipulators like him will even use the truth to deceive. Even when they're telling the truth, they're still deceiving. They're using the truth to manipulate you. Right? I didn't curse at him. I didn't go ballistic on him. All I did was point out the inconsistencies in his rebuke of Paula White and Kid Rock with what he said about Charlie Kirk. And he couldn't take it. And you won't find a comment like this one explaining, I just had to ban this guy E511 because he knows that my criticism was valid and he doesn't want anyone else pointing it out. And that wasn't the only comment of mine that he blocked. On this recent video that he did about Ruslan charging extra money for VIP tickets, I left this comment with another account right under his pinned comment. Remember, he was criticizing Ruslan for showing partiality to those with money. You know, you pay more, you get better treatment at this event. So I asked him, how is your members only section not showing partiality to those with money? Right? In other words, how are you not guilty of the very thing that you accused Ruslan of? Well, that prompted one of his crazy members, paying members, to come defend him. This person named Cactus Blob, who's been a member of his for almost a year, said most of the videos are later released to the public. Well, first of all, most means not all. So there are still videos that aren't public and never have been. And even with the videos that are made public, like the one that I showed earlier about Bethel and how he says this is an urgent warning to the churches, it's still showing partiality. The people with money get the videos before everybody else. It's a form of VIP treatment, early access, right? You get treated better than everybody else. VIP means very important person. And Pastor Grant treats you like a very important person if you give him at least $10 a month. You get a video first or get exclusive videos. So already we're off to a very bad start with Mr. Cactus Blob. He's saying things that are completely irrelevant, just like Pastor Grant does. Then he says, besides, Mike is an actual pastor and a real Christian, unlike the scammers at Ruslan's abominable conference for heretics and blasphemers. So apparently, if you're an actual pastor and a real Christian, then you're allowed to show partiality based on money. That's what Cactus Blob just said. Well, his name is very fitting. Apparently, the condemnation of showing partiality only applies to non-Christians and frauds, which is funny because I thought the epistles were written to actual Christians, actual pastors. But apparently Cactus Blob is under the impression that James was addressing heretics and blasphemers in James 2. This is the fruit of Pastor Grant, everybody. You will know them by their fruits, which is something that Pastor Grant acknowledges. And he's one of those false teachers who you can recognize by their fruits. Next, he says, the Bible says a pastor should make a living from preaching the gospel. Yes, it does. This is another straw man, which is what Pastor Grant did to me. The rotten fruit doesn't fall far from the rotten tree. The issue is selling. The issue is hiding things behind paywalls. The issue is showing partiality. Like I said at the beginning, this is what made Jesus flip over the tables in the temple, buying and selling. Then he says, you owe Mike an apology. This reeks of a touch not the Lord's anointed atmosphere. This comes off like a follower of a cult defending his leader when he's exposed. This is disturbing. Can you imagine how this guy would sound in person? Right? And if he's giving money to Pastor Grant, he would presumably, I don't know if he does, but he would theoretically go to his church if he lived nearby. So if you tried pointing out something wrong with Pastor Grant or something hypocritical he did, this is the treatment that you would get at his church. And then he says, but then what did I expect from a moron who listens to Jim Bakker and Glenn Beck? So he looked at my subscriptions and falsely assumed that I followed those people. No, I subscribe to false teachers to follow what they're saying. And notice the angry insulting. Moron in all caps. Again, this is the fruit of Pastor Michael Grant. And remember what he said about blocking this Ozzy fan. He got mad at him for saying the truth about Ozzy. Well, it's the same thing here. He didn't quite curse me out, but he's stepping in that pool with moron in all caps and demanding an apology. All I did was ask a question. How is your members only section not showing partiality? And look at the response it generated. And many people say this of me, that I flip out and insult them for asking simple, genuine questions. But they won't ever actually give an example because it's all a lie. Okay? This is an example of an actual, simple question being asked and getting insulted immediately in return. This is an example of what they're talking about. This is what they think I do to them. This is the narrative that they try to paint of me. But they can't ever provide an example because it's all in their head. And Pastor Grant said that Aussie fan who cursed him out proved his point about cheap grace. Well, Mr. Cactus Blob, who's a paying member of Pastor Grant's little cult of personality, proves my point about him, that he's a deceitful hypocrite. Because deceitful hypocrites like him defend him. Look at how this guy flipped out and insulted me. He couldn't handle his leader being cross-examined. And neither could Pastor Grant, apparently, because he immediately blocked this account too. And frankly, this is almost worse than the other one because at least he responded to that one. This one, he didn't even bother responding because he had no answer. He knows that it's showing partiality, and he can't explain how it's not. And people wonder why Good Fight Ministries and Spencer Smith and Mike Winger, Donnie Discerned, and even John Pounders now have blocked me. This is why. They know I'm on to them, and they can't contend with my questions and criticisms. Same with my brother William of Bible Broadcast, who ran scared after he realized that his slander campaign against me didn't work. And then Donnie Discern blocked me when I questioned him about whether or not he was being paid to fight the anti-Israel narrative. He was all confident until I asked him about it, and he literally begged me to stop. Here he says it. John, enough of this, please. And then when it became clear to him that I wasn't going to stop, he blocked me. And this is one of the reasons why a few years ago, I made it a point to no longer block people. I did it at first because it was overwhelming having to deal with so many twisted and obsessed hypocrites. But at a certain point, I started realizing that it was better to just let them run their mouths. And I also knew that not blocking people was another way of separating me from the wolves. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. I'm sure that's not the last that I'll be talking about this guy, since other hypocrites I know seem to be a fan of his. But in the meantime, I'm going to try to put out some shorter videos about big picture stuff that's been happening lately. The war, Third Temple, and the rising hatred of Israel all over the world. Bear with me, a lot has happened, and there's still a lot to talk about. And I'm trying my best to figure out how to get all this information out. So until next time, God bless and peace be with you.